history books often describe the Cold War as a frozen conflict. We're told stories of a bipolar stagnation in Europe, where the Iron Curtain locked borders in place and nuclear deterrence stopped the tanks from rolling. That narrative is Eurocentric and incomplete. While the borders of Europe remained static for 45 years, the borders of Africa were fluid, kinetic, and constantly on fire. Africa was the theater where the ideological rigidities of Washington and Moscow collided with the chaotic reality of decolonization. It was a war of resources, ethnicity, and maps drawn by dead colonial administrators. The alliances here sometimes defied all logic. In Nigeria, the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom fought on the same side against France and apartheid South Africa. In the Horn of Africa, the United States and the Soviets literally swapped client states. This was a messy, brutal struggle where local warlords manipulated global superpowers to settle regional scores. From the uranium mines of the Congo to the sands of the Sahara, this is the history of the shadow wars that shaped a continent. On November 1st, 1954, the National Liberation Front, or FLN, launched 70 coordinated attacks across Algeria. France was stunned. It was home to 1 million Pieds Noirs, white settlers who owned the best land and controlled the economy. They demanded the rebellion be crushed, and Paris sent 400,000 troops to do it. The FLN realized they couldn't beat the French army in a conventional battle. So they moved the war into the cafes, cinemas, and narrow alleyways of the Casbah, launching a campaign of urban terror designed to provoke a massive French overreaction. The French responded by deploying the 10th Parachute Division under General Jacques Massu. These were elite shock troops fresh from Indochina. Massu instituted the quadrillage system, locking down the population in a grid. His troops normalized the use of torture, using electricity and waterboarding to dismantle the FLN's networks. Tactically, the French won the Battle of Algiers. They destroyed the FLN leadership in the city. But strategically, the FLN outmaneuvered them by internationalizing the war. As Matthew Connolly notes in A Diplomatic Revolution, the rebels realized the real battlefield was the United Nations. They forced the United States to choose: support a NATO ally in France, or support the principle of self-determination, which the Soviets were loudly championing. The FLN used Soviet support at the UN to isolate France diplomatically. This pressure destroyed the French Fourth Republic, forcing the government to collapse and bringing Charles de Gaulle back to power. By 1962, France had enough. De Gaulle signed the Evian Accords, granting independence. The result was a massive exodus of 900,000 Pieds Noirs fleeing to France within months. Worse, the French army abandoned tens of thousands of Arquis, Algerian Muslims who had fought for France, to be killed by the FLN. Algeria proved that an insurgency could defeat a major Western power by leveraging Cold War geopolitics. It became the training ground for the very movements, like the ANC and MPLA, that would fight the proxy wars of the next 3 decades. The chaos went global on June 30th, 1960. When Belgium granted independence to the Republic of Congo, they left behind a state designed to collapse. The territory was the size of Western Europe, rich in copper and uranium, yet the colonial administration had trained 0 Congolese officers. Belgium intended to maintain control from the shadows. The commander of the Force Publique, General Emile Janssens, told his black troops that before independence equals after independence. He was wrong because 5 days later, the army mutinied. The government lost control of its own guns, and in the vacuum, the province of Katanga declared independence. Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba was desperate. When the United Nations refused to authorize force against the separatists, Lumumba made the decision that defined the war. He sent a telegram to Moscow, and Nikita Khrushchev responded immediately, sending transport planes. This was a nightmare situation for the Eisenhower administration in Washington, as the Congo held the uranium used in American nuclear weapons. This led to CIA Director Allen Dulles labeling Lumumba a mad dog, and the station chief in Leopoldville was ordered to eliminate him. The CIA and Belgian intelligence coordinated with Colonel Joseph Mobutu to then capture Lumumba, and they then delivered him to his worst enemies in Katanga. On January 17, 1961, Lumumba was executed by firing squad, and to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine, a Belgian police commissioner dug up the body, hacked it to pieces, and dissolved it in sulfuric acid. But killing Lumumba didn't end the war. His followers launched the Simba Rebellion in 1964, and Washington needed a fix, but they couldn't send Marines. So they turned to Mad Mike Hoare. Hoare recruited 5 Commando, a unit of white mercenaries from South Africa and Europe. The CIA provided the air cover, hiring exiled Cuban pilots to fly B-26 bombers over the jungle. Hoare's mercenaries crushed the rebellion by 1965, and the crisis ended with Mobutu seizing absolute power. He renamed the country Zaire and ruled for 32 years as a loyal American client, looting the treasury while the West looked the other way. The Nigerian Civil War was where the Cold War completely lost its mind. By 1967, Nigeria was the giant of Africa, populous and sitting on oceans of sweet crude oil in the Niger Delta. But the British had stitched the country together from rival ethnic groups that barely tolerated one another, and after a series of brutal pogroms in the north left thousands of Igbos dead, the eastern region decided it had had enough. On May 30th, 1967, Colonel Odomegwu Ojukwu declared independence, naming the new nation the Republic of Biafra. This declaration triggered a war that destroyed every assumption about Cold War alliances. The federal government in Lagos needed weapons to crush the rebellion. Britain, their former colonial master, was paralyzed. They wanted to protect Shell BP's oil assets, but were terrified of the bad press involved in arming a war against a breakaway state. They agreed to supply rifles but refused to sell heavy weapons. General Gowon in Lagos really needed those heavy weapons though. So he turned to the Soviet Union, and Moscow saw a golden opportunity to gain a foothold in West Africa. Within weeks, Soviet cargo ships were unloading crates of AK-47s, heavy artillery, and MiG-17 fighters at the port of Kano. Since the Nigerians didn't have pilots trained to fly them, the Soviets sent Egyptian and East German pilots to fly the combat missions instead. Suddenly, you had a British-backed government flying Soviet jets piloted by Egyptians and East Germans. The Biafran side was even stranger. Outgunned, Biafra found friends in the most contradictory places. France, under Charles de Gaulle, backed Biafra to break up the Anglophone giant that threatened French dominance in West Africa. French intelligence flew weapons from Gabon into Biafra at night. And then came South Africa. South Africa didn't want a strong, unified black nation, instead wanting black Africa remaining chaotic, justifying apartheid rule. To top it off, Israel sent captured Soviet weapons to Biafra to distract the Muslim-dominated government in Lagos. The war on the ground was a stalemate. Frustrated, the Nigerian government imposed a total blockade. Nothing went in, no food, no medicine, and no fuel. The result was the first televised humanitarian disaster in history. Images of skeletal Biafran children with distended bellies were beamed into living rooms in London and New York. It shocked the world and birthed the modern humanitarian aid industry. Doctors Without Borders was formed largely in response to this horror. But starvation is a slow weapon. The Biafrans needed a miracle to break the siege. They almost got one from a Swedish aristocrat. Count Carl Gustaf von Rosen was a commercial pilot disgusted by the Nigerian Air Force's habit of bombing aid planes. He smuggled 5 tiny Swedish training planes, MFI-9B Minikoins, into the country. He strapped rockets to the frame and painted them green. Von Rosen and a handful of mercenaries flew these planes at treetop level, cutting their engines to glide silently over Nigerian airfields. They popped up at the last second to unleash their rockets, destroying millions of dollars worth of Soviet bombers on the tarmac. It was a tactical miracle, the ultimate David vs. Goliath moment. But it was a strategic failure. The blockade was just too strong, and by 1970, the Biafran population was physically unable to fight. 2 million people had died, the vast majority from hunger. In January 1970, Biafra surrendered and Nigeria was preserved as one nation in one of the most confusing wars to ever take place in the Cold War, and perhaps history as a whole. Back in Central Africa, the ghosts of the Congo crisis returned to haunt Zaire. Mobutu Sese Seko had instituted a policy of authenticity, banning Western names and suits, but he hadn't fixed the state's rot. He had pillaged the copper revenues to build palaces in the jungle, leaving his army unpaid and his people destitute. In March 1977, the FLNC, better known as the Katangese Tigers, crossed the border from Angola. These were the veterans of the old Katanga secession who had spent years fighting as mercenaries for the Portuguese and the MPLA. This was Shaba 1, and the Tigers marched through the mineral-rich Shaba province, welcomed by locals who hated Mobutu. The Zairian army, or FAZ, simply melted away, and officers sold their fuel and weapons to the rebels rather than fight. Mobutu screamed for help, claiming this was a Soviet-Cuban invasion. But in reality, the Cubans had tried to stop the invasion, fearing it would give the West an excuse to attack Angola. But the Cold War logic prevailed. The Safari Club, a covert alliance of French, Moroccan, Egyptian, and Saudi intelligence services formed to fight communism in Africa, swung into action. France provided the airlift and Morocco provided the soldiers. 1,500 Moroccan troops arrived in Shaba and pushed the Tigers back into Angola. Mobutu declared victory, but he didn't fix his army. So, 13 months later, the Tigers returned. This was Shaba 2, and it was different. The rebels realized they had to hit the West where it hurt. They bypassed the border garrisons and struck directly at Kolwezi, the mining capital that produced 70% of the world's cobalt. The Tigers captured the city and took 3,000 European contractors hostage. It quickly turned into a massacre. Fueled by alcohol and drugs, the rebels and undisciplined Zairian soldiers began executing civilians. Over 100 Europeans and hundreds of Zairians were killed. This time, France didn't wait for a coalition. President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing ordered the 2nd Foreign Parachute Regiment of the French Foreign Legion to jump. It was a legendary operation. On May 19th, 450 legionnaires dropped directly into the city center, outnumbered 10-1. In the ruthless 48-hour house-to-house battle, the legionnaires routed the Tigers, killing 250 rebels and securing the mines. They were followed by Belgian paratroopers who evacuated the civilians. South of Eritrea, the geopolitical map was about to be turned upside down. For decades, the Cold War alignment in the Horn of Africa was static. Ethiopia was the American anchor and Somalia was the Soviet anchor. Then, in 1974, a devastating famine in Ethiopia exposed the rot of the imperial monarchy. Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown by a committee of junior military officers known as the Derg. The Derg was led by Major Mengistu Haile Mariam. He was a ruthless operator who solved political disputes with a pistol. He declared Ethiopia a Marxist-Leninist state and launched the Red Terror. In the streets of Addis Ababa, tens of thousands of students and intellectuals were hunted down and executed. This created a geopolitical absurdity. The Soviet Union now had 2 Marxist allies in the region, Somalia and Ethiopia. Siad Barre in Somalia saw Ethiopia in chaos and saw an opportunity. He wanted the Ogaden, a vast desert region inside Ethiopia inhabited by ethnic Somalis. In July 1977, Barre committed the ultimate sin of the Cold War. He took a Soviet-supplied army and invaded a Soviet-aligned state. Somali mechanized brigades, equipped with T-55 tanks, smashed through the disorganized Ethiopian defenses. They captured 90% of the Ogaden in weeks. Moscow had to choose. They simply couldn't support both sides, and Ethiopia was the bigger prize. The Soviets thus abandoned Somalia and went all in on Ethiopia. Barre, furious, expelled all Soviet advisors and turned to the United States. Overnight, the Soviet proxy became the American applicant. The Soviets responded with the largest airlift in African history. They flew $1 billion worth of weapons into Ethiopia in 3 months. Then, Fidel Castro stepped in, committing 15,000 Cuban combat troops to save the Ethiopian revolution. The counteroffensive in 1978 was a masterclass. General Vasily Petrov, the Soviet commander, airlifted Cuban tanks behind the Somali line, flanking them through the mountains. Caught in a pincer, the Somali army was crushed. While armies clashed in the Horn, the white minority government in Rhodesia was fighting a war defying the inevitable. In 1965, Prime Minister Ian Smith declared independence to preserve white rule in Rhodesia. The country became the world's pariah, hit with the first ever United Nations total embargo. But for 15 years, the country survived because it sat at the heart of the White Redoubt, a secret strategic alliance between Rhodesia, apartheid South Africa, and the Portuguese Empire in Mozambique. As long as the Portuguese held the coast, Rhodesia could breathe. This meant, however, that there were parties that wanted to see the Rhodesian government fall, and they tried. The war to overthrow Smith was a microcosm of the communist world's own civil war. The resistance was split down the middle by the Sino-Soviet divide. ZAPU was the Soviet client. They were trained in Russia and Cuba to fight a conventional war, holding back their forces for a final invasion. ZANU, eventually led by Robert Mugabe, was the Chinese client. They were trained in Maoist People's War tactics, focusing on politicizing the peasantry and digging in for the long haul. These two groups hated each other almost as much as they hated the white government, frequently engaging in deadly factional firefights in the bush. The Rhodesians were pound for pound the most effective fighting force in the world. To survive the sanctions, they cannibalized their own economy to build a high-tech counterinsurgency machine. They created the Silu Scouts, a unit that specialized in pseudo-operations, dressing as guerrillas to infiltrate and poison the rebel networks from the inside. The end came in 1974 when the Portuguese Empire collapsed. Suddenly, Rhodesia's eastern flank was wide open, bordered by a hostile Marxist Mozambique. The final dagger came from Washington and Pretoria. US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and the South African government decided that Ian Smith was a liability. They feared his stubbornness would invite a massive Cuban intervention that would threaten South Africa itself. In a supreme act of Cold War realpolitik, South Africa cut off Rhodesia's fuel and ammunition. Smith was forced to surrender by his allies, and in 1980, the Chinese-backed Robert Mugabe swept the elections, handing the keys to a Maoist revolutionary who would rule for over 4 decades. When the Portuguese Empire collapsed in 1974, it opened the gates to the single most dangerous conflict of the African Cold War. Angola was twice the size of Texas, rich in oil and diamonds. 3 factions fought for control: the MPLA, which were Marxist and Soviet-backed, the FNLA, which were CIA-backed, and UNITA. In late 1975, the CIA saw a chance to deliver a knockout blow to Soviet influence. They encouraged South Africa to invade. In response, Pretoria launched Operation Savannah, a lightning strike with a South African armored column, Task Force Zulu, racing north toward Luanda. The MPLA panicked and they asked Moscow for troops, but the Soviets hesitated. The MPLA then called Havana. Fidel Castro didn't ask the Soviets for permission, and on November 4th, 1975, he launched Operation Carlota. Cuba airlifted 36,000 combat troops and heavy weaponry across the Atlantic. They utilized old Bristol Britannia turboprops to fly thousands of miles, turning the tide of the war. The Cubans brought with them a weapon that terrified the South Africans, the BM-21 Grad, known as the Stalin organ. At the Battle of Ebo, Cuban special forces ambushed the South African column. The Stalin organs decimated the South African armored cars, and Pretoria was shocked. They'd expected a cakewalk against ragtag guerrillas, and instead they ran into a hardened conventional army. Abandoned by the US Congress, which cut off CIA funding, the South Africans retreated. The war in Angola was inextricably linked to the land south of the border, Namibia. To the United Nations, this was a sovereign country illegally occupied by South Africa. But to the generals in Pretoria, Southwest Africa was their fifth province, a vital buffer zone against the black communist onslaught. The apartheid regime believed in the domino theory even more fervently than the Americans. They argued that if Namibia fell to the SWAPO liberation movement, the red flag would soon fly over Pretoria. This belief birthed the Border War, a conflict that lasted 23 years and militarized the entire South African society. The South African Defence Force turned northern Namibia and southern Angola into a single, continuous theatre of war. They instituted a doctrine of defensive defense, and they didn't wait for insurgents to cross the border. Rather, they launched massive mechanized raids, like Operation Reindeer and Operation Skeptic, deep into Angola to smash SWAPO bases before the guerrillas could even pack their kit. But inside Namibia, the war was different. It was a dirty, close-quarters counterinsurgency fought in the bush. To win this war, the police created a special unit called Cobalt, which is Afrikaans for crowbar. Cobalt was designed to pry insurgents out of the local population. The unit was composed mostly of black trackers led by white officers, often former Rhodesians who had lost their own war and were hungry for revenge. They drove mine-resistant Caspier armored vehicles, fearsome V-hulled beasts designed to survive a direct hit from a Soviet anti-tank mine. Cobalt became a death squad masquerading as a police unit, racking up the highest kill rate of the entire conflict. South Africa used the war to stall. For a decade, they ignored UN Resolution 435, which called for independence. They insisted on linkage, arguing they would only leave Namibia if the Cubans left Angola. It was a diplomatic stalemate paid for in blood, maintaining the occupation until the Cold War itself collapsed. While the South was locked in a grind, the deserts of Chad saw the Cold War's strangest tactical revolution. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, flush with oil money and Soviet weapons, viewed Chad as his client state. He occupied the northern Awzo Strip with a conventional Soviet-style force, 8,000 men, heavy T-55 tanks, BMP armored carriers, and MIL Mi-24 Hind gunships. Opposing him was Hissène Habré, a brutal warlord backed quietly by the CIA and France, who saw Gaddafi as a Soviet stooge. Habré's army was a ragtag force with no armor and no air force, but they did have 400 Toyota Hilux pickup trucks. The Chadians stripped the trucks and mounted French Milan anti-tank missiles and heavy machine guns in the truck beds. The resulting conflict, the Toyota War, turned military doctrine on its head. The Chadians used the open desert like an ocean, and they drove in columns at 100 kilometers per hour, flanking the lumbering Libyan tanks. They would speed in, fire a wire-guided missile at a tank's weak rear armor, and vanish into the dunes before the Soviet turrets could even traverse. In the Battle of Fada, the Chadians destroyed an entire Libyan armored brigade. In 1987, they raided the Matan al-Sara airbase inside Libya, destroying 30 combat aircraft on the ground. The toll was staggering. Over 7,500 Libyan soldiers killed, $1.5 billion in Soviet equipment destroyed against only 1,000 Chadian losses. In a small, dusty town in southern Angola in 1987, the Angolan army, pressured by Soviet generals who still didn't understand the bush, launched a massive conventional offensive to crush UNITA. It was a trap, and the South African Defence Force was waiting. As the Angolan columns advanced, The South Africans unleashed their new G5 howitzers, which outranged anything the Soviets had. The South Africans smashed the Angolan brigades, destroying them piece by piece, and forcing the survivors to retreat into the town of Cuito-Cuanavale. The SADF laid siege, sensing a final victory that would humiliate Moscow. Fidel Castro raised the stakes one last time, realizing that if Cuito-Cuanavale fell, the apartheid regime would look invincible. Without insulting the Soviets, he sent his best pilots and his most advanced T-62 tanks to Angola. For 6 months, the largest conventional battle in Africa since World War II raged. In the air, Cuban MiG-23s, flown by their best aces, tangled with South African Mirage F-1s. The MiGs eventually established air superiority, and on the ground, the Cuban tanks halted the South African advance in the minefields. The battle ended in a bloody tactical stalemate, but a strategic victory for the left. South Africa realized it could no longer win militarily. The cost in white conscript lives was becoming politically toxic at home, and the war was bankrupting the treasury. In 1988, peace accords were signed in New York, and South Africa agreed to withdraw from Angola and, crucially, to grant independence to Namibia. 2 years later, Nelson Mandela walked out of prison, and the apartheid domino finally fell. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the money and the weapons stopped flowing into Africa. But you can't simply turn off a war that has run for 30 years. They left behind a continent awash in cheap AK-47s and landmines. The conflicts fueled during this time period didn't vanish when the Greater Cold War ended. They just mutated, and the warlords who had been on the CIA or KGB payroll found new ways to fund their wars, birthing the resource wars of the 1990s. The Cold War in Africa was a war of projection. The superpowers projected their own fears and ambitions onto a continent they barely understood. They treated Africa as a chessboard, moving pieces to block their opponent. And when the game was finally over, they swept the pieces off the table and walked away, leaving the players to clean up the blood. But what do you think? Did we miss any African conflicts? If the superpowers left Africa alone during this time, would the continent have been better off? Are there other lesser-known Cold War proxies like this one that deserve the spotlight? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.